What's up everyone, it's King Moosh here with JCross X to welcome you all back for episode 11 of Unit Overview. In this series, we'll be analyzing all the playable units in Fire Emblem 3 houses regarding their recruitment requirements, personal abilities, stats, spell lists, and everything in between to determine their strengths and limitations. We also provide potential class recommendations for all these units, as well as rank them on a tier list at the end of our analysis. These videos are generally gameplay focused, so we do our best to avoid story spoilers, but we always advise you to watch with discretion anyways, and if you haven't played 3 houses yet, we highly recommend that you do. Before we get started with this episode, I'd like to quickly introduce this website called Wonder Trade. It's a platform for buying, selling, and trading video games and consoles with a primary focus on retro games. The site is managed by a few of our friends, so if you're in the market, we would both really appreciate if you check it out. You can search for wondertrade.shop or click the link in the description. Thanks for listening, and without further ado, let's get to the video.
This episode will be focused on Dedue Molinaro, the loyal retainer of Dimitri and the Blue Lion's house. He is not present in the first battle, but he will be playable in the majority of battles if you select to teach the Blue Lion's house after the prologue. Dedue is also not recruitable out of house either, being in a similar situation to Hubert where their unyielding loyalty binds them to a specific route. Dedue also has some availability issues, not being present between chapters 13 to 15 post time skip, and disappearing entirely if you do not complete his associated paralogue, War for the Weak. As such, it's imperative that you complete this prologue if you want Dedue to remain in your army post time skip. Similarly to Dimitri from last episode, since Dedue is exclusive to the Azure Moon route, you can't raise support with him unless you opt to teach his house. In-house, the only gameplay benefits are linked attacks as well as unlocking his support conversations. Regardless, if you do want to raise his support, there are a couple ways to do so. One of these ways is to find his lost items and return them to him. Starting in Chapter 4, you can find his gold earring in the Knight's Hall. Afterwards, in Chapter 6, his gardening shears can be found in the training grounds. Lastly, in Chapter 10, you can locate his iron cooking pot, once again found in the Knight's Hall. Dedue also has a fair amount of gifts that he likes too. Like all units, he likes to receive owl feathers, but he also appreciates exotic spices, floral adornments, and watering cans. Moving on, we have tea parties, which are a good way to raise support with the additional benefit of being able to increase Byleth and Dedue's charm. To have an easier time with the tea parties, it's best to use Cinnamon Blend, for Spice Blend, or Ginger Tea, which are his favorite tea blends, as well as the Hresfelg Blend or Lester Cortania, which is enjoyed by everyone. As for his crest, Dedue has none, which means he will take damage whilst using the Hero's Relics. It's not always a bad thing for a unit to lack a crest, and Dedue is one of the most extreme examples of this. Dedue is a prime candidate of taking advantage of low HP builds, and also has a very strong combat art that benefits from him being at lower HP thresholds, which I'll talk about soon. Honestly, not having a crest is a huge buff for his viability, and if it did have one, it would more than likely be a hindrance for some of his strongest setups.
Dedue's personal ability is Stonk Shield. This ability activates whenever he uses the wait action, granting him a +4 boost to defense for the remainder of the turn, disappearing when the next player phase arrives. It's considered the same type of boost as Rally Defense, so the two of them cannot stack. However, Stonk Shield will stack with certain defense boosting abilities like Defense +2 and Defiant Defense. This is definitely one of the most impactful abilities in the early game. The +4 defense boost makes a big difference in the early game when enemies have lower stats. Combined with Dedue's naturally great defense, this personal ability allows him to bait out enemies while taking little to no damage, assuming you keep him out of range of any magic users. That's pretty much a cheat code to clearing the early maps. Just send Dedue a bit further ahead into the enemy range, baiting out a few enemies, and they will end up weakened from his counterattacks, making it very easy to converge on them during the player phase. That being said, Stonk Shield definitely falls off in value pretty quickly, usually after the first few chapters. As units start to get higher stats, the +4 defense boost makes less of a difference, and the opportunity cost for giving up his player phase becomes more severe as he unlocks certain tools. Dedue will often want to lower his own health, so sometimes he may find value in the defense boost to get him to certain HP thresholds. However, this can backfire if you're trying to get him to low HP and he ends up not taking enough damage. For that reason, it can be helpful to have Dedue hold a few Pure Waters each battle. If you want to avoid the defense boost and attacking an enemy isn't a viable option, then you can use a Pure Water as an alternative to wait.
Looking at Dedue's skill levels, we see there's a fair amount of things going for him. While he doesn't have a budding talent, he does have 4 different boons with varying usefulness. Starting off, we have his boon in Heavy Armor. Although we don't think armored classes are too good in this game, Dedue is probably one of the better users of them given his high HP and defense. He also starts with an initial rank of D, which means he can certify for Armor Knight the moment he reaches level 10. Dedue also has a boon in both Lances and Brawling, which are 2 strong weapon types in this game. For Lances, Dedue has a very useful combat art that he can lock in his dependent combat arts list, and for Brawling, his high strength means that he benefits greatly from the Brave effect that gauntlets have. He also starts with an E+ rank in both, which means he innately has Brawl and Lance Prowess level 1. Lastly, he has a boon in Axes with a starting rank of D+. We also think that Axes are one of the stronger weapon types in this game, with them bolstering the highest might, generally speaking. Given his starting rank of D+ Axes, Dedue will start off with Axe Prowess level 2 and the Combat Art Smash. Given Dedue's middling dex at the start of the game, having access to both Smash and Axe Powers level 2 right away helps his case a lot when it comes to early game hit rates. The starting rank is also really nice since it allows him to certify for Fighter right away, while already being close to guaranteeing certification for Brigand. That's all for the boons, but Dedue does unfortunately have a couple banes that are worth discussing. First, I'll gloss over the mostly inconsequential one, the Faith, which basically does nothing to harm him as a unit. Dedue has poor magic stats generally, and there are no impressive spells in his Faith spell list specifically, so this bane hardly matters. As for his other two banes, they both suck for the same reason, and those are the ones that he has in riding and flying. Throughout the advanced, master, and even intermediate stage, there are a fair amount of mounted classes that are beneficial to do. While it sucks to have a bane in one of these usually, having a bane in both is unfortunate since you will have to push through at least one of them unless you want to lock yourself to infantry classes. While you can do this for Dedue, some of his best classes are riding and flying ones, so we generally think that it's usually worth to try and push at least one of these banes to certify for them. Once you do certify for at least one, the skill bonus these classes do have help mitigate the bane a bit, but it definitely would have been nice if he only had to deal with one of them.
Dedue has extremely min-max base stats, which mostly works out to his benefit. Let's start with the bad parts. His base magic of 2 is the absolute lowest in the game, which really doesn't matter much since he has almost no reason to use a spell list. His base res is only 1, which is tied with Raphael for the lowest in the game. This leaves him very vulnerable to enemy mages, but as long as you pay attention to their range, you should be fine. His base dex of 5, base luck of 5, and base charm of 4 are all in the lower end of average. His accuracy with gambits will be pretty shaky for a while, and regular attacks won't be super consistent either, though combat arts and prowess abilities do help a lot. He won't have particularly high crit rates either. Moving on to the rest of his stats, his base speed is surprisingly 7, which is actually pretty average. You would expect him to be a lot slower, but he has a pretty respectable speed tier for the beginning of the game, especially combined with his base strength of 12, which helps him offset a decent amount of weapon weight. His strength is tied with Dimitri for the second highest in the game, only behind Byleth and Edelgard, which is excellent. Alongside his strength, his bulk is where he really shines, as I alluded to before when discussing his personal ability. His base HP of 30 is tied for the highest in the game, and his base defense of 8 is the absolute highest in the game. Overall, Dedue's bases put him in a really great spot for his role as an early game prot tank with solid damage potential. As for his growths, they tell a very similar story to his bases. Magic and res are both extremely low at 15% and 10% growth respectively, so don't expect them to get much better throughout the game. If you do want to patch either stat, certification bonuses or stat boosting items will be much more effective than relying on his extremely low growth rates. On a similar note, his dex, charm, and luck growth are all still in the lower end of average, just like his bases. He has 30% dex growth, 25% luck growth, and 30% charm growth. In order to make him more consistent, you'll need to take advantage of abilities, battalions, and combat arts to improve his accuracy and crit rates. Once again, he is very min-maxed to benefit his HP, strength, and defense. His strength growth of 50% is quite high, especially combined with his great base, which keeps his damage output relevant throughout the game. His defense growth is also 50%, which is the absolute highest in the game, clearly establishing him as one of the best prot tanks in the game. As for HP, his growth of 60% is the second highest in the game, only behind Raphael, which is helpful not just for his survivability, but also for his damage output with a combat art that we'll describe soon. Finally, while he starts with a decent base speed, his speed growth of 20% is one of the lowest in the game, so he's going to start to fall behind very quickly. That being said, speed isn't really as essential for him as it is for most units. He has good damage output without doubling because of his strength and combat arts, and can survive being doubled by most physical attackers because of his HP and defense. In fact, sometimes being doubled even works out in his favor if he's trying to lower his HP.
Despite not unlocking a combat art via a budding talent, Dedue has a fair amount of combat arts at his disposal, bolstering one from lances as well as a couple from brawling and axes. Starting with easily his strongest art, we have the coveted lance combat art Vengeance, which he unlocks at C+ lances. For 4 durability, this combat art boosts might by 2 and crit by 10, which sounds bad on paper, but it also has the additional effect of dealing increased damage based on missing HP of the user. Given Dedue has such a large HP pool as well as high strength, this art can do ridiculous damage in his hands and is easily one of the best users of it. This also ties back into him not having a crest being an advantage, as lowering his HP can often be rewarded greatly with high damage nukes from this art specifically in the player phase. This is Dedue's only lance combat art, but it's easily one of the best ones present within 3 houses. Next we have his axe combat arts. Starting at C+ axes, Dedue is granted the combat art Monster Breaker. For the cost of 5 durability, this art increases might by 9 with no other buffs. As you could have guessed, however, it's also good against enemy monsters since it has the effective property tied to it, meaning weapon might is doubled in the damage calculation when using this art against monsters. While for the sake of consistency, you are usually better off using Smash given the increase to hit, Monster Breaker serves as a decent nuke option for axes and something that is potentially worth equipping if you know an upcoming map will have a lot of monsters present. Next at A rank axes, Dedue unlocks Armored Strike. This art costs 4 durability and boosts might by 3, with once again another added effect, that being boosting damage based on the unit's defense that he's using the combat art. While we haven't been too kind to Armored Strike before, it genuinely is probably one of Dedue's best nuke options in the late game, assuming you have stacked a large amount of defense on him, since 30% of his total defense could actually be a lot of added might. Although Vengeance is generally just a lot stronger with a little bit of setup, this art isn't actually that bad of an option for him. If you are fine with taking the time to set up Vengeance, however, then generally I would still have Smash over to Armored Strike due to axes being relatively inaccurate and Smash providing a lot of consistency. Lastly, we have his Brawl and Combat arts. 1-2 Punch is the one he unlocks at C+, and quite frankly, it's a great Brawl and Combat art. While it loses the Brave effect present on Gauntlets, it still guarantees that Dedue will make a follow-up attack after the first blow and denies an enemy unit theirs, which is pretty nice given Dedue's low speed and how prone he can be to doubling. The art itself costs 4 durability but boosts hit by 20 and might by 8, which is pretty high for a Brawl and Combat art that hits twice, even if it's not in succession. Dedue is more than capable of taking a few hits anyways, and we already mentioned why him taking damage could be a good thing too. The final combat art Dedue has at his disposal is Mighty Blow, unlocked at A Brawling, but is generally just worse than 1-2 Punch in most regards. For 3 durability, it boosts might by 10 and crit by 20, but reduces hit by 5. The combat art also disables the Brave effect from Gauntlets and doesn't make a follow-up attack either, which generally just makes it weaker than 1-2 Punch or a normal Gauntlet attack. While it probably has the highest damage out of a single individual Gauntlet attack, it's hard to justify using it when the art takes away the main strength of the weapon type.
Since Dedue has no budding talent, the only dependent ability he gets is Battalion Wrath, obtained by reaching rank C Authority. This ability activates when your unit's Battalion Endurance is at or below 1/3 of his maximum endurance. If this condition is met, Dedue will receive a flat plus 50 boost to crit whenever an enemy initiates combat with him. This ability usually works best on either dodge tanks or prot tanks so that they can avoid taking damage before counterattacking with a crit, allowing them to effectively wipe out groups of enemies during the enemy phase. Since Dedue is one of the best prot tanks in the game, he naturally falls under this archetype, and Battalion Wrath is a mainstay of his prot tanking builds, particularly when using armored classes. I will say that this ability potentially suffers from competition with the regular version of Wrath once it becomes available during the advanced stage. Normally the Battalion Endurance condition is easier to meet than lowering your unit's HP to activate Wrath, but Dedue wants to lower his HP for Vengeance anyways, so Wrath can actually be more convenient sometimes. The main advantage is that it can be unlocked earlier since Wrath requires mastery of an advanced class. Even if you're planning to use the regular Vantage Wrath combo later, you can use Battalion Wrath alongside Vantage before you unlock Wrath to start enemy phasing earlier. You can also stack both of them together if your crit rates aren't high enough. Both these strategies require you to manage both his HP and his Battalion Endurance, so it might not be optimal for many players, but it's nice at least to have the option. Also, if you're choosing not to build around Vengeance for whatever reason, maybe focusing on 1-2 Punch instead, then Battalion Wrath is definitely preferable over Wrath. You can stay at full HP, which makes his prot tanking a lot safer.
As we've mentioned a few times, Dedue is not really a magic-oriented unit, and this reflects in his spell list. He does have a fair amount of fire spells in his Reason list though, and we'll at least cover those briefly. At D Reason, he unlocks the low-weight spell Fire. In the early game, the spell is pretty solid, providing 3 might, 90 hit, and 10 uses, making it one of the more reliable spells at this stage of the game. Its low weight of 3 also allows its faster casters to double usually, but that wouldn't be the case with Dedue. At C Reason, he unlocks the spell Bolganone. This spell is slightly heavier and inaccurate at 85 hit and 6 weight, but it does have a fair boost to might going up to 8 with the lowered uses of 5. It's a solid damage upgrade to Fire, and not much else aside from that. Lastly, at A Reason, Dedue actually has one more spell, that being the penultimate fire spell, Ragnarok. Its might for a spell is pretty high at 15, with a decent hit of 80 with the added benefit of 5 crit. While it does go up to 9 weight and only has 3 uses, it's definitely a pretty solid spell to have access to. As for his Faith spell list, Dedue of course unlocks Heal Nosferatu at the D&D plus Faith ranks like every other unit, providing him basic healing and white magic damage. He only gets one other Faith spell, that being Recover at C Faith. Recover is basically just an upgrade to heal that given it still requires adjacency, but it has higher might with less uses. This can be helpful to achieve higher healing numbers of units who generally don't have fantastic magic, Dedue included. However, given his Bane to Faith as well as his magic being one of the worst in the game, I can't really recommend raising his Faith in my right mind. This also extends to his Reason skill too. While his Reason list is not the worst one we have seen, and he also doesn't have a Bane for the skill, his magic stat itself is just so bad that he would never really be doing significant damage with any of his spells.
Dedue has numerous strengths in combat, and one of his most distinctive ones is his prot tanking capabilities. He has some of the absolute best defense in the game, paired alongside a massive HP pool that makes him extremely capable of tanking attacks, even when getting doubled. If you take advantage of things like shields, protection boosting battalions, armored classes, and defense boosting abilities, including his own personal ability, he's capable of taking little to no damage from most physical attacks. Even against enemies that can break through his defenses, his HP acts as a nice safety net. His prot tanking makes him a very strong enemy phase unit, especially alongside his access to Battalion Wrath. It's not like he's limited to this role either, because his player phase stands out arguably even more than his enemy phase capabilities. He can get Vengeance typically as early as Chapter 3, and as soon as he gets that combat art, he essentially gets the highest player phase damage output in the game from that point all the way until the end of the game. Bernadetta and Cyril also get Vengeance, but they have both less HP and less strength than Dedue does, so he generally has the higher damage ceiling. It's often massively overkill for most regular enemies, so it doesn't make too much of a difference in most situations. However, it does make him exceptionally useful for boss killing. For example, Vengeance with the Horse Slayer is an easy way to defeat the Death Knight. Even before he gets access to things like Vengeance and Battalion Wrath, Dedue's personal ability gives him a niche of his own in the first few chapters. The only unit who can really compete with Dedue for this niche at the beginning of the game is Balthus. Honestly, Balthus is probably the better early game unit of the two, but Dedue is still one of the strongest in the early game, and I would argue that Dedue has better longevity than Balthus primarily because of Vengeance. Overall, the main strength of Dedue just is his exceptional combat, which comes from the powerful tools in his kit and his heavily min-max stats. It's not like he's just a Vengeance one-trick either, since he's also a great user of gauntlets with 1-2 punch. He even has a Might support with Dimitri to bolster his damage further when using linked attacks.
Dedue is a very strong unit, but he does have a couple of weaknesses that are worth bringing up. The first one is a weakness that I highlighted earlier and would like to bring up again, and that is his banes to both riding and flying. Like I said in the skill section, Dedue has a number of classes in the riding and flying categories that greatly benefit his combat. Pushing past these banes is required to use one or the other, and while he does have some good infantry options, we really do think that some of the best classes are mounted. If you want to reach any of them, you will have to push past at least one of these banes to do so. Next up, we have to mention his setups. While he does have some great enemy phase builds and a strong player phase thanks to Vengeance, even with him lacking a crest, it can take some time to get his builds going. This means for low turn count, he's generally not an optimal unit given his setup time depends a lot on the placement of enemy mages usually, since Dedue himself is so tanky and takes barely any physical damage in most situations. Speaking of enemy mages, Dedue himself is generally very vulnerable to any and all things magic related. His res is really bad and something you do have to play around to not only set up his builds, but also to make sure he doesn't outright die to them. He has to respect their space unless he can close the distance and one round them without being exposed to another nearby caster. Lastly, we think his most major weakness is his availability. Firstly, of course he is only available if you select the blue lines at the beginning of the game. However, not only is Dedue not present for a few chapters at the start of the time skip, but he never comes back at all if you never manage to complete his paralogue. Obviously, this can be mitigated if you just spend that time to do his paralogue, and of course we highly recommend that you do so since Dedue is a great unit and not one that you'd want to lose, especially if you already put time into investing into him. We could also consider his very poor magic stats as well as his lackluster spells a weakness, but honestly this is very standard for heavily dedicated physical units and something I can't really harp on to do much for. Overall, there really isn't a lot Dedue lacks, and most of his weaknesses are relatively minor and can be played around.
Before discussing the beginner class options, I have to quickly go over the commoner class for Dedue. HP plus 5 is a useful mastery in all units, but Dedue is one of the most important units in the game to equip this ability on. That's because it improves the tank capabilities in the early game and expands his HP pool for Vengeance, providing a potential damage boost equivalent to that of Lance Fair. This can maintain relevancy in his build for quite a long time. Once you get to beginner classes, I think there are two really great options, Fighter and Soldier. Dedue can certify for Fighter without any investment because of his base rank and axes. We recommend Fighter in almost every physical unit because of his mastery ability, Strength plus 2. It provides a very consistent buff to damage output, and because the bonus applies to every hit, it works especially well with Gauntlets and Dedue's Brawling Boon. That being said, we also think there is a strong argument for Soldier. He can't guarantee certification for Soldier without any investment, but it really doesn't require much to raise Lances to D considering his starting rank and boon. The investment is worthwhile anyway since he can pick up Tempest Lance, one of the best early game combat arts, and make progress towards unlocking Vengeance. Soldier comes with a few benefits over Fighter. It grants a boost to Lance FP from battle, which can help you pick up Vengeance a bit faster. His Mastery combat art, Reposition, is definitely a more useful positional combat art than Shove, which is the one Fighter gets. This isn't a super big selling point for me because Dedue is a very high value player phase. I would rarely want to sacrifice it just to reposition on their ally, but having the option is nice, especially in the early game when movement is limited. Finally, its Mastery ability is Defense plus 2, which isn't that useful in most units, but for Dedue, it synergizes with his Protang capabilities. Even small boosts to defense can make a big difference on Dedue's ability to completely nullify damage. Overall, both these beginner classes provide great value to Dedue, and you can't really go wrong with choosing either of them. As for intermediate classes, there are a lot of options that Dedue can go with during the stage. The one I usually try to master as soon as possible is Archer. Dedue's underwhelming dex stack can make his accuracy really inconsistent, so picking up hit plus 20 from mastering this class is a great buff to reliability. As for the certification, he's only neutral in bows, so it does take a decent amount of investment. But I think it's worthwhile, especially since you can pick up Kershaw along the way. It's not even a bad combat class at all either due to the extra bow range it grants. Another class we almost always recommend for physical units during this stage is Brigand. It's the easiest intermediate class for Dedue to certify for because of his base rank and boon and axes. It's fairly underwhelming in most aspects, but its main appeal is its mastery ability, Death Blow, which is one of the best abilities in the game. It provides a huge damage spike in player phase, which might be a little overkill for Vengeance, but it's still great, especially for his combat with Gauntlets. If you meet the axe requirement for Brigand, then you can also guarantee certification for Armor Knight, since he meets the heavy armor requirement with his base rank. Dedue isn't too likely to gain any defense points from the certification like most of their units are, but the main benefits of this class are the defense stat boost and growth rate modifier he gets while using the class, which improve his Protang capabilities. Another class, similar to Brigand, that Dedue consider using just for the mastery ability is Mercenary. Mastering Mercenary grants the ability Vantage, which is a good buff to Dedue's enemy phase capabilities. However, if you're not planning on running a Vantage Wrath setup, I would not recommend using this class. It is very mediocre for combat, and requires a fairly significant amount of investment in his swords, which isn't particularly rewarding. The last class I want to mention is Cavalier. Despite Dedue's Riding Bane, it's honestly not too hard to certify for since you can gamble the certification with E plus Riding. Since Dedue can't act as Pegasus Knight, this is his highest combat performance class during the intermediate stage. The combination of 7 movement and Canto allows him to quickly navigate the map, nuke enemies with vengeance, and safely retreat. The boost to riding the Lance XP also make the path to Paladin and other cavalry classes a bit easier. If you don't want to bother with Cavalier, I would pick either Armor Knight or Archer as his combat class for difficult missions, and focus on picking up the masteries and auxiliary battles.
As Josh has said, Paladin is a potential great upgrade from Cavalier in the advanced stage if you manage to grind enough riding XP to push past Dedue's Bane. Dedue's speed is already negligible, so the debuff the class has to speed is not really too impactful for him specifically. As for its strengths, it has 8 move, Canto, and Lancefare, which really sets this class apart as being one of the best classes for him to utilize the power of Vengeance with. The class itself also has decent boosts across the board, notably the strength, defense, and HP, all of which Dedue appreciates. It also helps that Dedue is exclusive to Azure Moon, the route that is easily the most friendly towards cavalry units. If you don't feel like pushing past his Bane and are more interested in going down the Prot Tank route, then Dedue's Boon and Axe and Heavy Armor makes the Fortress Knight a relatively easy certification. Like I said when talking about Paladin, the speed penalty hardly affects Dedue since he is so slow to begin with. Meanwhile, this class provides the highest defense boost in the game of plus 10, alongside a plus 5 to HP. Early on in the advanced stage, this can make Dedue untouchable, as even if a unit doubles him, they will often do little to no physical damage. The class does have very bad move for the advanced stage, and obviously you do have to play around enemy mages carefully, but that isn't too incredibly difficult since they generally don't have great move either. Although we personally don't like armored classes for the lack of move, it's hard to argue against the fact that Dedue is a unit that can make them somewhat viable. Dedue also can take advantage of either of the other Axe classes in the advanced stage too. Generally for Warrior, you just want to stick him in this class to acquire Wrath for enemy phase builds, giving him a massive boost to crit when he is equal to or below half HP and is attacked by an enemy. However, Warrior is not so bad to spend some time in either to maximize Dedue's strength, given Warrior's very high strength growth modifier. This also extends to its HP growth modifier too, which can be useful for pushing the limits of Vengeance even further. Wyvern Rider is also one of Dedue's best combat classes in the advanced stage, offering 7 move, Canto, and Flight for extreme positional flexibility. Although it lacks Lancefare from Paladin, its own fair skill, Axefare, is at least useful on him since Dedue is a pretty good user of the weapon type. It isn't too much different from Paladin, however, as the main purpose of this class would be generally just to go around and nuke things with Vengeance and retreat with Canto, but you still have to push past the Bane to get to it. Lastly, we have Grappler, which is another great player phase class given its mastery of Fierce Iron Fist. Dedue's Brawling Boon makes this a pretty easy certification, and even though it doesn't have the mobility of a mounted class, 6 move with Forest Walking is the best you're going to get with infantry classes, which is pretty solid all things considered. Given his high strength, Dedue is a prime candidate for taking advantage of the Brave effect on Gauntlets, as well as Fierce Iron Fist's ability to strike 3 times in total. As for Master Stage classes, there are a fair amount of options you could choose. While this is not at all necessary, if you want to push for Great Knight from Paladin, the boost to riding skill XP present from Paladin alongside Dedue's natural affinity for axes and heavy armor can make this certification not too bad. Although it's infamously one of the harder classes to certify for, there is a valid case for throwing Dedue into this class since it's an armored class that actually has good move at 7. While it doesn't have as high of a boosted defense as Fortress Knight does, we think that actually being somewhat mobile is more than worth the cost. On top of being a decent Prot Tank, it offers weapon flexibility as well given it has both Axe and Lancefare as class abilities. This class is definitely solid for dual phasing, having the mobility to move around the map and strike with Vengeance while still having the capabilities to Prot Tank in the enemy phase. As for other options, Dedue could also go Wyvern Lord at some point if you decide to take him down the flying path. Although it might take longer than some units given that Wyvern Lord's certification requirements are relatively steep and Dedue has a Flying Bane, that is perfectly fine since Wyvern Rider is more than capable of being an endgame class. If you manage to reach Lord though, it has one extra move and some of the best stat boosts present within the game, which are some of the main appeals to upgrading from Wyvern Rider. Lastly, we have War Master. This is another hybrid class that has 2 fair skills Dedue can appreciate, that being Axe and Fist Fair. As for its last class ability, Crit plus 20 is also very much appreciated on Dedue since his luck and dex aren't exactly the highest. Once again, this class has great boosts across the board, offering a plus 5 to strength, which is basically another fair skill in and of itself. It also has a great selection of masteries, Quick Riposte, and War Master Strike. War Master Strike is a powerful combat art that does effective damage to all foes, which again, doubles weapon might in the damage calculation. As for Quick Riposte, this ability is pretty useful but is somewhat anti-synergistic with other enemy phase abilities, since it requires you to be at or above 50% HP to guarantee a follow-up attack for a unit. Overall though, it's a great choice for Dedue.
Dedue's tier placement was a pretty difficult decision for us, but the S- tier is the one we agreed on. He does have legitimate weaknesses, mainly his availability is the one that prevents him from being completely busted, but very few units can match how consistently high his power level is from the very beginning of the game all the way to the end. According to the poll on my channel, most of you voted Hilda as better than Dedue and Hubert, but Dedue still got about a third of the vote. That's honestly a bit surprising to us, as we've always viewed Dedue as the best of the 3. That's not to downplay Hilda because she's also a really great unit. I suppose it comes down to a difference in playstyle and what traits you value in a unit, and for us, Dedue earns a spot near the top of the list. As for a recommended build for Dedue, there's really a lot of great options. You could go for a full player phase setup based around Vengeance, or even ones based around 1-2 Punch. You could go for full enemy phase setups and armored classes to take advantage of prod tagging with Battalion Wrath. You could do a War Master build based around Quick Riposte. He has so many strengths in combat that there are almost too many options to list here, so as always, please share your suggestions in the comments. The one that we typically go with is a low HP dual phasing build based primarily around Vengeance for player phase and Vantage Wrath for enemy phase. We typically run this build on Paladin, mostly just because we value mobility. However, this build could absolutely work on Wyvern Rider or really any of his endgame class options. Obviously, the first 2 slots will be filled by Vantage and Wrath. Then, we really appreciate some sort of accuracy boost. We typically run both Hit plus 20 and Lance Prowess 5 just to ensure consistency, but if you're only going with one, we would probably recommend Hit plus 20. It makes the player phase more versatile because it applies to other things like gauntlets and gambits, while Lance Prowess 5 only affects lances. As for the last slot, we typically go with Lance Crit plus 10. Since Dedue has pretty low dex and luck, this makes his crit raise more reliable, which is very important for his enemy phasing. That being said, this slot is really flexible depending on your needs. You may want to consider running Battalion Wrath if Lance Crit plus 10 still doesn't provide enough of a crit boost. It can be difficult to manage both Battalion Endurance and HP, so alternatively, you can consider running this build in War Master and taking advantage of the class ability Crit plus 20. If you need more damage, there are plenty of options like Death Blow, Strength plus 2, HP plus 5, and even Lance Fair if you can push that far. On the topic of high investment abilities, Movement plus 1 is also excellent. However, it'll usually be tamed quite late, if at all, because of Dedue's Riding Bane. Overall, the main goal of this build is to charge into enemy lines with below half HP with the Killer Lance Plus equipped. Once you get in, you can enemy with Vengeance, and then position Dedue to draw aggro during the enemy phase. Because of Vantage Wrath, you'll almost certainly wipe out anyone that dares to try attacking him, so this strategy allows him to contribute so much value during each turn. I'd highly recommend giving this build a try if you've never used him this way before. That's about all we have to say about Dedue. If you enjoyed the video or have any thoughts of your own, please leave a like and make sure to comment. I also recommend checking the description if you're not already subscribed to both of our channels. Stay tuned for the next episode of Unit Overview, which is about the next member of the Blue Lion's House, Felix Hugo Fraldarius, on Jeff's channel this Saturday. Thanks for watching.
I will break you. Give up.